Ron Block NR2B, who is our guest for this evening. Good evening, Ron, and go right ahead.
All right. Thank you, Nomar. Thank you for inviting me to have this opportunity to present. Just in case you recognize this picture, it is the one that was in the QST back in July of 2022. And it is our clubhouse, the Gloucester County Amateur Radio Club. And it exists in the town of Mullica Hill. And it's on a portion of the 4-H grounds, which I believe the property is owned by the county. So we have a lease there that's got another 15 years or so to go. And so we have this donated trailer that we have fixed up over the years. And of course, grown a couple of antennas and filled it with lots and lots of equipment. And in fact, at this point in time, on, say, Tech Saturday, which is toward the beginning of the month, the place is bursting, and we actually need a larger facility. But what we're going to talk about tonight is the grounding system in the process of being installed in this location. So what I thought I'd do is begin by just talking a little bit about the basics. And, the picture shows thunder cloud, called an anvil cloud, that's sort of coming directly toward us. And the danger in that whole thing, as it's traveling at about 25 miles an hour, is about up to 10 miles in front of it. Lightning being some of the loudest sounds that are created by Mother Nature. Even so, it's only audible 3 to 4 miles, maybe 5 on a good day, because of attenuation by water vapor and things like that in the air. So if the danger zone's 10 miles in front, you can only hear it coming 3 to 4 miles away. There's a little thing called out of the blue, which I know for a fact happens. It's actually happened to a friend of mine. He and his daughter were walking on the beach, and she was struck by lightning, and of course did not survive. The lightning strike, the average spark is about 5 miles long. So it's not a short thing, and it's a very, very, of course, very, very high voltage. About 30,000 amps for the first strike, and about half for the subsequent strikes. And then sort of on the right-hand side there, I've given the range. The range is about 3,000 to about 140. And I think more modern thinking says that 140 is probably closer to 200. But still, the range is still in the 3 to 140 area. And then that still leaves a percent or two on each end of that probability curve that is undefined, which means it can be less than 3 or a whole lot more than 140 or 200. The rise time is kind of interesting. The rise time on that pulse for the first strike is about 1.8 microseconds. And if you look at that from an RF perspective, that's right in the middle of the AM broadcast band, about 500 kc. However, the range goes from 1/4 of a microsecond to 12. And then the subsequent strokes actually have a much faster rise time. They're on the order of 1/10 of a microsecond, which puts you up in the 10 megahertz range. So you're starting to get a feel here, I hope, that noise, the bang, the spark, the RF energy is on band with our equipment. And then, of course, as you look at a lightning strike, you notice that it sort of flickers. It is flickering, but that's because there are subsequent events, lightning strike events that are occurring. And so the average is 2 to 3. So that's sort of a very quick overview of what that whole world is like. So now let's go into the genesis of why we did this. As a consultant, I guess it was 9 years ago or 10 years ago, something like that. As a club member, I said, hey, we really need to put in a decent ground system for our club. And so I made a proposal and got reviewed and said, yep, we got to come back to that. And of course, as many, many things happen in a club, nobody ever quite got around to spending a lot of money and doing a lot of work because they didn't see the payoff. A grounding system doesn't impress anybody. However, when Mr. Hill came by and said that he had a friend, Donald Sturbley, KH6 DX, his friend said, hey, I want to give an Elecraft KPA 1500 amplifier. Now that got everybody's attention. Oh, we've got to get that. We've got to put it in. We've got to put it in operational condition. And of course, John reminded us that, hey, it needs a ground. And the emphasis is on the letter A ground. Okay. We don't have just one in this particular facility. When we started this, we had a bunch of them. Okay. Now, circled in red here are the various grounds. You see on the left-hand side is the VHF tower. That was 100-footer before the storm. On the right-hand edge, the triangle over there is the HF tower, and then there are numerous other smaller towers and posts holding antennas, as well as the box in sort of almost in the middle there, which is the AC connection. So yes, we had a whole bunch of grounds, none of which were interconnected. Okay, so you look at that and you say, okay, what does that really mean to me? Okay, so now here is a case. Nice, interesting slide. Shows a tower and it shows a utility ground. Now, everybody's aware that the utility, once your AC is brought into a structure, there's at least a ground rod, usually two, that are put in for current sync. So now if we assume that we're going to have a lightning strike on the tower, which is probably the most likely thing to happen, what's going to happen is that energy is going to go down the tower and be distributed over the entirety of the ground area that's near that tower. Okay, so you see it coming out and being dispersed. Now, something I just was able to get some information on today is that I've often wondered what's the speed at which that energy that's coming down that tower, that strike energy, how fast does that get dispersed? And I knew it was not, of course, going to be dispersed at the speed of light. That just doesn't work. However, what I was able to come up with, at least on the first blush approach to this, is that it's really going anywhere from 3 to 60 meters per second. That's pretty slow. That's milliseconds. That's 166 to 333 milliseconds. And I'm sure, they're probably only the center part of that curve. There's probably items that go before and after it. And a lot of it has to do with the conditions of the ground, what kind of soil is there, and how much moisture is in that ground. That all influences how fast that's going to go. However, now if we go take the same setup and we sort of stop midstream, this is showing that if you're looking at the tower and the tower is just dissipating the energy into the ground, and then if you do a little freeze action on that and then look at the utility ground is not even aware that the lightning strike has happened. Of course, a few hundred milliseconds later, it's going to be aware, but at some point in time, it is not aware. Okay, so what does this mean? If we were to take a radio and connect it to the tower via its coax, and then go plug it in, guess what? The radio is now the equalizer, and it conducts much better, much faster than the Earth will be able to do it. Okay. Now let's look at that in a more practical sense. Okay, here's a case where we've got a tower and we've got a coax coming down that tower, and I've shown that in blue, and I've tried to be consistent with that in all the slides. And then the AC side is in red, and you can see that both the blue coax has a ground rod at the base of the tower, and you see that the utility has a ground rod at the base of the electric meter. Okay, that's exactly the same as our prior slide. Now what happens if we take a strike on that tower? The energy is going to come down the tower and follow the coax to the radio, go through the radio, wiping it out, and then following the path back through the AC and into the AC ground. Everybody comfortable with that? All right, so now the question comes, this is the basic implementation for us. You bring home a radio, you connect it to an antenna, you plug it in, you turn it on, and you're on the air. But you're vulnerable because you're bridged between two ground systems. Okay, well, what do we do? This brings us to a thing called a single point ground panel. Okay, that's that light green thing in the middle of the picture. And on there are mounted two protectors, one on the coax side and one on the AC power side. Okay, the third connection in there is a green that comes from the chassis of the radio to the same panel. So what's fancy? The title is fancy, of course. Single point ground panel. Sounds impressive. All it is a conductive surface. It's made of metal. It can be copper, it can be aluminum, or if you want steel, but it's going to rust. So maybe that's not such a great idea. But any conductive surface, it can be any shape, can be any size. The only requirement is that you mount protectors on it for cabling that leaves the immediate vicinity of the radio. So in this case, the first cable that leaves the radio is the coax. So you see a little rectangle there in the middle that shows the coaxial protector. And then on the right-hand side of that is the AC power protector. The job of these two protectors is it's somewhat simple. When you overvoltage them, they short the casing of the protector. Okay, so in the case of the coax, it shorts the center pin to the case. In the case of the AC power, it shorts the hot and the neutral to the case. With the two protectors mounted on a conductive surface, you now have the radio connected to the outside world during the strike event by a single logical wire. That then protects the radio. So now when the energy comes down, it sort of makes the U-turn at the single point ground panel and proceeds to find itself a ground, which in this case is still the AC. And what it does then is that it does not conduct the energy through the radio, but, and this is a very important but, it elevates that radio to a substantial voltage. Now, depending on the amount of strike energy that's there and many other things, that radio could be sitting anywhere from several thousand volts to some low tens of thousands of volts. So the admonition here is don't hold on to it, because if you do, it's going to conduct through you into some other ground system and it'll destroy the radio also. Here's a blown up view of the single point ground panel. The coax is blue, the AC is still red, and the ground connections are green. And so you can see that the coax protector is mounted on here in larger stations where you've got multiple radios or multiple coaxes coming in. You will have multiple coaxial protectors. If there are amplifiers involved, most likely the 220 volt versions of same, then you'll probably have multiple AC protectors also. If there's a rotor that's controlled by a piece of equipment on the near the radio, then there'll be a rotor control protector on there. Also, too, note that there's a dotted line through the middle of the single point ground panel, and on the right-hand side it's labeled protected and unprotected. That's because some of the protectors, most particularly the AC protector, which the good ones have inductance in them, you will actually have during the strike event and going into protected mode, you will actually have a fairly substantial voltage difference between the input to the protector, coming out of the AC power line, and the protected side of that power protector going to the radio. Now, if those two cables, if the protected cable, let me say it that way, gets too near the unprotected cable on the AC side, there's a chance for a flashover. And that defeats the whole purpose of your protection system. So there is a real definite dividing line between protected and unprotected cabling. Now, that's not to say that it has to be a horizontal dividing line. It can be in any direction. Okay, only because the single point ground panel can be oriented in any direction and have any shape whatsoever. Okay, now one of the issues that has come up as a result of one of my QST articles a little bit ago, I kept getting the question, well, single point ground panel, I don't want it inside because that brings the energy from the strike indoors, and then I've got to take it back outside again. And that's just not the way to go. Okay, I can understand that. There's good reasons for this. So I did put together another article, which is actually coming up in QEX, March, April of this year, that shows that there's basically three primary locations for the single point ground panel. You can do the part of it that says it's through the wall. That means literally you cut a hole in the radio shack outside wall, probably 16 inches wide because that's the usual stud spacing, and some height, depending upon how big a single point ground panel you really want. And you replace that hole in the wall with a piece of metal, aluminum or copper. And then you use that as your single point ground panel, and then you mount your coaxial protectors on it, and you mount your AC protectors on it, and you take the outside surface of that panel and you connect it to a nice wide connection that takes it into an earth connection. And then you take your chassis and connect them on the inside surface of that panel. And that's the top picture on the right-hand side. So it's pretty straightforward. However, it has its problems. Living in the Northeast as we do, the temperature humidity differences between the inside and the outside, with that metal panel being on both sides of it, are going to cause all kinds of water problems and mold and mildew and things like that. So it's not so practical in a residential environment in the Northeast, at least. So that's option number one. Option number two is outside the shack. There's a lot of literature that shows this, and there's just in fact many articles that show, yes, we've driven a ground rod in and we mounted our coaxial protectors on it, and we bring the cables inside and we assume we're protected. You're not. We'll come back to that. You must also mount your AC power on that outside area, and that presents a significant problem in being able to do the mechanics of the moving the cables through the wall and things like this. And I guess I didn't say why. I skipped a step. One of the reasons that you want all your protectors mounted on the single point ground panel is that they all need to see the elevated surge energy at about the same time, and they all need to short circuit at about the same time so that the radio is connected to the outside world with one logical cable. Now, electrons travel about a nanosecond per foot. So and damage has been known to occur in the 10s and 20s of nanoseconds in certain delicate circuitry, such as radio front ends, especially when you've got silicon as the first item after the capacitor connecting to the antenna. So timing becomes an issue. That's the reason then that in the outside the shack, the second picture, it becomes difficult and somewhat cumbersome, actually, to put the power protector out there. Now, of course, you've got to shield it because of weather, but the issue that we talked about just on the prior slide is the separation between protected and unprotected. Now, in the picture, you see the AC coming out of the wall, going through the wall down toward the bottom, and then the AC coming back into the shack significantly above the wall outlet. And that's what you have to do. You can't run the AC going out to the protector and the AC returning from the protector. You can't run those cables out next to each other because of the potential for spark gap, assuming there's an inductor in that AC power protector. So the outside version has a lot of difficulty, and it's interesting to see that many, if not most of the articles that want to encourage you to do that and have great reasons for doing it, ignore the power side and don't even talk about it. So now there are other ways of doing that. if the distance between the outside protector and the inside shack wall is fairly close, I'm talking maybe 5, 6, 7 feet, then we can put a copper strap between the two pieces of the single point ground panel and keep the AC protectors indoors. Okay, the third one is within the shack, and that's the bottom picture on the right. And that's the one we've been talking about in all the examples, because that's sort of the easiest. The biggest disadvantage with this is that the energy does follow the coax all the way into the structure, and then gets on the ground connection and goes all the way back out. As a compromise in the arrangement, it's probably the one that's the easiest to use, and you haven't given up too much, assuming that your cables are properly grounded and that the connection to that single point ground panel is fairly wide. Now, one of the rules of thumb that I generally use here is if you've got a 1/2 inch coax coming from the antenna, that's about 1.5 inches of surface area for energy to follow. So I would suggest that the ground connection from the single point ground panel be at least 1.5 inches going back outside. That at least gives it a fairly even chance of following that path and keeping the energy under control. Of course, then you can go to a wider connection, a 2 inch or 3 inch or 4 inch type of ground connection, if that becomes practical. Now, shops that have multiple coax cables coming in, and maybe even some 7/8 or 1 1/4 and stuff like this. Okay, you still want to have as much, if not more, surface area leaving the single point ground panel going to a ground system than you have arriving at the single point ground panel. Okay, and then the last item on this slide, and this sort of came up a couple of days ago talking to Ward. He gets questions on, what about moldable ground panels? If I take my coax coming down the tower and I put a plate out there and put a couple of protectors on it, and then we run the cable, 50 or 100 feet over to the house, and before it enters the house, we put another plate and put a couple of more protectors on it, and then we get it up to the radio room, and hopefully we put it on a single point ground panel, not unlike the third picture. Okay, so the reason I mentioned that is we got to make a very sharp distinction between the single point ground panel, which its purpose is for timing. It's to get all those protectors to see the surge at the same time, versus individual panels that may be put in prior to this all the way out to the antenna. The only reason, in my view, for any other protectors in this circuit would be for secondary protectors, because you're going to run the cable through the structure. Now, a good friend of mine many years ago had me help him put his radio station back together. And he actually had 3 towers. And so he brought a whole bunch of cables in or all hard lines, and brought them into the basement through the window, ran about halfway across the basement ceiling, ran then up to the 3rd floor of about a century-and-a-half-old house, across the top of the ceilings in the 3rd floor, down to the 2nd floor, across the ceiling in the 2nd floor, to end up in the radio room on the 1st floor. Now, there is no way that I want to see the energy on that cable follow all the way through that kind of a path in the structure to end up at the single point ground panel, where it's going to say, okay, good, here's a ground path, and then I can go out into the earth. So what you do is you install a secondary, emphasis the word secondary, single point ground panel, if you will. I just call it a panel, secondary panel. And you put this probably at the entrance to the basement. And on there, you mount coaxial protectors, rotor control protectors, and you ground it. And the only purpose for those protectors as a secondary set of protectors is to get the energy off the cable before it traverses the house. That's its only purpose. So that's what I mean by if multiples. And, you can get extravagant. You can put a third set or a fourth set in there. I don't think it's quite justifiable financially, but you can certainly do it. So, okay, let's go back and look at our house example now. And here is one way to help fix the problem where the utility ground is not connected to the tower ground. And across the bottom of the diagram, just below the earth line, you see a bunch of green stuff. And on the right-hand side is the original utility ground. And then there's a thing that I've labeled perimeter ground, which I'll come back and talk about in a couple of minutes, that does a connection between there and the tower ground rods. And on its travels, we spike in a couple of other ground rods. Okay, so this now does the interconnect between the two ground systems. So now when we take a hit, okay, the radio certainly does get elevated. However, the energy now has more paths to ground, which means you've got less current flowing through all the different connections. Okay, so this gives you a better approach to life. Okay, so that's the premise now that we're talking about. You've got to be able to get the radio, or in the real world, sets of radios and its associated electronic equipment, to the point where anything that leaves the immediate vicinity has to have a protector mounted on the single point ground panel. And that single point ground panel, I won't say must, but I will say should be grounded. It's not safe if it's not, but it's at least an expedient. But it really, really should be grounded and with a nice wide connection so that it has it's the favored path for the surge energy. Okay. So let's go back now to the clubhouse. And on the right-hand side, we have the HF room, which is where we started first. And that was basically the subject of the article that appeared in QST. It's not a very big room at all. It's actually pretty small. And we wish it were bigger. Actually, we wish the trailer were bigger. However, the HF room, if you look, there's a green line inside the room, and that is our single point ground panel. Now, in this case, it's not a discrete panel that's, 8 inches by 12 inches or something like that. It happens to be a piece of 6-inch wide copper strap that runs most of the perimeter of the room. Okay, it's on at least 3 walls. And then that 6-inch wide copper strap is taken outside the trailer by the 2 green horizontal lines, which will eventually meet up with a thing called a perimeter ground, which we'll talk about. Okay, let me just digress here and look at this. This is what the room used to look like. Okay, so it was full of equipment. This picture was taken 10 years ago. So, but everything was in use. All those nice X's that are on the wall were outlets that all had to be removed and relocated below green line, which and near the floor. So we removed all the equipment. We did a complete rewire of the AC because this particular HF room was at the opposite end of the building where our Ethernet switches were. We decided to put fiber optics in there just to keep things isolated. And then we installed the single point ground panel, which is the green horizontal line. That's the 6-inch wide copper strap. And then, of course, we mounted all our protectors on that copper strap. Okay, then we reinstalled everything. So that's basically how that works. That was not a trivial task. That whole room was rebuilt in the interim. And then here's some of the guys, putting the room back together and running some copper strap and digging a trench outside for the 6-inch wide copper strap to come back into the room. And then we'll come back to some of these pictures on the bottom, which are the protectors, the coaxial protectors, and how they're interconnected with the radios. So now here's a shot of the 6-inch wide copper strap coming out of the room, coming from that 6-inch horizontal single point ground panel. And I guess the first thing that you might want to notice here is that nice rusted gray piece of metal is actually the beam or steel beam that holds the facility together. So of course we attached to it, and then ran the 6-inch copper strap in a ditch that's about a foot deep with a ground rod at the end as a temporary connection. And there are 2 of these coming out of this HF room. This is a sort of a pan of the 6-inch copper strap on a backing board as it goes around the room. We have a couple of stills of the area now. Okay, the first thing to note here is the T going down through the floor. That's the 6-inch copper strap that you saw on the outside. That's one piece of copper strap, and then it's sandwiched to the horizontal portion of that 6-inch piece of copper strap. To the right of that is another smaller, it's probably 2-inch copper strap that goes up and ties to the ground in the electrical distribution panel that's just off the top of the edge of the picture. The other thing that you should notice is between those 2 points, you see a nice shiny aluminum box with a yellow plug on the output side and a yellow plug on the input side. Okay, that's an AC power protector. That happens to be a PolyPhaser unit. And it comes with a beautiful 12-foot cord. And it pains me greatly to cut off about 15 of those, almost all of that cord anyway. And you almost must do this. You don't want to have excess cordage. The normal operation for that protector, if somebody doesn't do it correctly, is to take the cord and wind it up and put a couple of tie wraps on it if they want to be really neat, and then plug it in. The trouble is there's a tower not too far away, and that tower will radiate mag fields. And that nice coil of wire will become the secondary of a transformer and will add to the amount of energy that has to be protected by that AC power protector, assuming that the cord is on the unprotected side. Similarly, if you've got excess cabling on the protected side, they are also antennas and secondaries of transformers. They will pick up energy and will induce it on the protected side. And that's not exactly what you want. So we've got to be a little bit careful there. It's a pain in the neck, but our guys did that. And in fact, actually went to the extreme of, if you notice the wall connection, it is a single outlet. Now that's just 110 volts, but normally it comes as a duplex, 2 of them. Not here. Frank Romeo, who did the installation, went off and got special single outlet connectors so that there was no chance that anybody else was going to plug into that thing. So some of the precautions you might have to take. The other thing you should notice is that the output of the AC power goes to that sort of a black thing that looks like a power strip. And it is, in fact, a simple, unadulterated, unprotected AC power strip. And there are several of them in the room. Just to the left of that, you see what looks like a light blue cable with a yellow cable going to it. That's our fiber interface. The fiber comes out of the wall, and since it's not conductive, it doesn't matter where it is, but it came there. And then the actual fiber to Ethernet converter, which is the little box that's mounted on the single point ground panel. Now, to the extreme left of that whole area, this is where the coaxials come in from the tower. And at that time, there were 4 antennas on the tower. So you see just left of center, 4 coaxial protectors. To the left of that is the rotor protector for the antenna that's up there. And then to the right, there's a black box with a whole bunch of cables going in and out. And that happens to be a switch, a coaxial switch. And then again, if you look toward the leg of the table, you see a nice yellow plug, which is, again, a single AC outlet for the protector that's feeding this portion of the room. Okay, here's an overall picture of what the station looks like. This happened to be before the amplifier arrived, and I guess I haven't taken any pictures since, because this is the best one I've got. But you can see it's a pretty neat thing. Oh, let me go back and let me show you something here. Back on this picture, you see how the cables come up, and they appear to go behind or through these gray brackets that are on the wall about every 18 inches or so, or 16 inches. Okay, that's to prevent cables from contaminating each other. That's holding them separate so that the unprotected, which are to the bottom and the floor, are separated from the protected cabling, which is above center of the single point ground panel. So we just done that so that we can run cables and not worry about gravity killing our system, in 6 months or a year. Okay, back to the building again. Currently, we're working on the VHF side of the house, and we've run the copper strap around the about 3/4 of the way around the VHF room. And actually, it will go through the walls to the adjoining space because there's a test bench there and an equipment closet that needs to be protected. And in this case, we're going to have 4 6-inch wide copper straps coming from the horizontal single point ground panel into the earth. Okay. Now comes the sort of the finishing touches to the whole process. Okay. We still, if you look at this picture, when we're done, we still have independent grounds, but the equipment can survive because of the protectors. What unifies it all is this site. Here we have a thing called a perimeter ground, and that's the largest rectangle that encompasses the trailer. Okay. And the perimeter ground has a couple of functions. One, when that HF tower gets struck, okay, that energy is going to come down the tower and it's going to radiate, as we saw in the very, very beginning. Okay. Now, at some point in time, it will have elevated the ground near the tower, but the trailer doesn't know it's coming. Okay, and that's a good thing. Now, a couple of 100 milliseconds later, all of a sudden, one corner of the trailer is recognizing it has severely elevated. What happens usually next, without a perimeter ground, is that the trailer looks like a much better path to some other place than the earth is, because it's kind of slow. So the energy now jumps on the frame of the trailer, or in the wiring, or on the heating ducts, or on the insulation if it's a foil based, and follows that to some better ground system. And that causes you all kinds of problems. So what we do then is we put in a thing called a perimeter ground, which is the big square that basically is a short on the earth. And it has now, as the energy comes from the HF tower, the perimeter ground starts picking it up and distributing it at wire speed, not at earth speed, around the structure. And it tends to level out the voltages underneath the structure so that it raises and elevates kind of at the same time, not exactly at the nanosecond level, but when you're up at the millisecond level for sure. And so therefore it protects the trailer. Okay, that's its number one job. Its number two job is more important, actually. It is a tie-in of all the ground systems. If you notice on the HF side, on the right-hand end, the 2 6-inch copper straps that are coming out of the trailer in those 1-foot trenches tie into the perimeter ground. Same thing on the left-hand side in the VHF area. We have 4 6-inch copper straps coming out and tying to the perimeter ground. Now, in addition, we also tie on the right-hand side all the way up to the top, we tie to the HF tower. As we go through the middle above the trailer, we tie the propane tank. We don't want any explosions. We tie the satellite antenna. We tie the utility ground as we go right to left. And then there's other antennas and things like that, tie the generator in. So that is a most important step. And it's one that is I won't say difficult to do, but it's a lot of work. Okay, so now then the big picture is after we've gotten the perimeter ground in, we also want to put radials on each of our towers. And the purpose of the radials on the towers is to dissipate as much of that energy as is practical into the soil before it begins to follow the coax cables toward the radio roam. So what it does, it helps to disperse that. And in good soil, and I guess you say on a good day, you can probably disperse 80%, maybe 75 to 80% of the energy of a lightning strike in the radials associated with the towers. And then you've got much less energy following the coax back into your radio room. Okay, we alluded to this during the pre-meeting discussion a bit. On the 1st of September in 21, an EF3 tornado came through this area, destroyed 38 homes, and damaged about another 140. Okay, it passed right behind the clubhouse, right on that tree line from the opening shot. Most of those trees are not there now, and damaged both of our towers. I'm happy to say, though, that the HF tower has been replaced. New, better, bigger, stronger one. So it's actually up a few feet higher. And we've developed the spec on the VHF tower. We've identified funding, we think, depending on what we get back on the price. And we're sort of ready to move on that. That's sort of the update of the process. Now, it was interesting. I was looking at this slide and I figured this is rather self-serving. So maybe it's not a good thing. It's got my brother's article on grounding, NEMP protecting, and Ken Rand's version of the same document, and then 3 or 4 of my publications. So maybe that's not a good thing. But this one is. This is a very good publication. I did work on it with Ward and got a lot of very, very good information. It's very down to earth. It's something that I would encourage anybody who's wanting to fix the problem. Now, it's very interesting. I just happened to notice too, on the cover, you see the circle down in the lower right-hand corner? I don't see an AC power protector there. Interesting. Okay, and then just about the end, I've had enough experience, I think, at this point in time in my life, and done enough consulting, several hundred of them, that I decided to write a book. So this is my rendition of Ward's book, but it's specifically amateur radio and it's strictly lightning protection. Whereas in Ward's book, he covers lots of other areas that are also important to the process. This has the information on, what's the problem, a lot of which we've talked about tonight. It has the creation of a zone of protection, and then the single point ground panel that goes with that. And it talks about the grounding system and the reason for radials, the reason for perimeter ground, how you achieve it, how you measure it, and things like this. And right now it's about 80 pages, and I'm hoping by late summer that it's in print form and it can be available. Other than that, I'm ready for questions.